Good afternoon and welcome to breakout number 5, the use of artificial intelligence by the U.S. and its adversaries. Today's speakers will discuss the state of AI and how the U.S. can counter any Russian or Chinese advantages in the propaganda, cyber, and military domains. It is my pleasure to introduce DeEtte Gray, CACI's President, Business and Information Technology Solutions, who will now introduce the moderator. Off to you, DeEtte.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'd also like to thank AFCEA and INZA for all the hard work that it takes to put into hosting the Intelligence and National Security Summit, the premier event that enables the IC to come together to discuss and learn from one another to help continue to build this inspiring community. CACI has been a proud supporter of both INZA and AFCEA for many years. As a national security company, CACI is committed to delivering insightful intelligence support, innovative technology, and operational expertise that empowers and enhances our intelligence community customers as they tackle the most pressing national security challenges. I myself am honored to serve as the chairwoman of the AFCEA Board of Directors. I have the privilege of working alongside all the members of this incredible organization, consisting of some of the best and the brightest in our community. It is my pleasure to introduce one of those professionals, the moderator for this session, which is titled The Use of Artificial Intelligence by the U.S. Charles Clancy is a chief futurist and senior vice president and general manager at MITRE. Mr. Clancy is an internationally recognized expert on the topics of wireless, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. He currently serves as a member of the AFCEA Intelligence Committee, the INZA Advisory Committee, and the CNAS Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and National Security. And with that, I will now turn it over to Charles. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to breakout number 5. This is a panel entitled Use of Artificial Intelligence by the United States and its Adversaries. And it's my privilege to moderate an esteemed group of colleagues here to discuss this critical topic. Just in terms of big picture for the scope of the discussion today, really we're going to be looking at how Russia and China in particular are adopting artificial intelligence as key strategic components of their overall investment strategy and plan from a national security perspective. And then we're going to be talking a bit about how the U.S. is doing the same and really looking to draw a distinction between the U.S. strategy and the Russia and China strategies. Welcome questions from the audience. I think this will be a really interesting and lively discussion. But I'd like to first start off with some self-introductions from a few of our panelists. So Rita, if you could get us started with self-introductions.
Of course, thank you, Charles, for getting us. My name is at Georgetown University, and I focus on military applications of AI and on Russia.
Great, thank you. Elsa?
Great to be here, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elsa Kania. I'm an adjunct senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security, also a PhD candidate at Harvard, and I'm currently working on a book, Fighting to Innovate, which discusses how the Chinese military is approaching emerging technologies and the revolution in military affairs it believes is unfolding.
Great, thank you. Colonel?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Colonel PJ Maykish. I'm an Air Force officer serving as a senior military fellow at National Defense University, where I'm detailed full-time to the National Commission on Artificial Intelligence. For the NSCAI, I'm focused on threat evaluation, threat assessment, something that we call LOE7. But I look forward to today to speaking to you about anything we're doing from a strategy perspective across all our lines of effort.
Great, thanks. Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian Drake. I work for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I direct the artificial intelligence portfolio. That governs all of our investments that occur across all of our mission areas for the agency.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us today. and especially the panelists for taking time out of your day to speak with the group here. I wanted to start with really a better understanding of the adversarial environment. Right, so artificial intelligence is often sort of viewed synonymously with this growing area of great power competition between the United States and China, but also Russia as well, where we really have this interested intertanglement, perhaps to make up a word, between national security, economic security, and technology interests that's creating, I think, a really some interesting problem space, certainly for the policymakers as we try to maneuver through our economic policy and our national security policy and how these things all come together. Certainly our adversaries are taking a similar trajectory with how they think about these technologies as well, and how they invest in them and how they're deploying them. So I guess what I'd like to do is first have Rita explain a little bit about what's happening right now in Russia. I know, Rita, we're having a little bit of delay, I think, with some of your videos. So if there's major connectivity problems, I think we can pivot, but just be aware of that. So Rita, do you want to start with kind of a characterization of what's happening right now in Russia?
All right, sure. And my apologies for the delay in the video. Hopefully that's not Russian interference. All right, so let me just give the bottom line up front here. There's really no argument that Russia lags behind the United States and China when it comes essentially to all of the metrics that we focus on that are necessary for moving forward in AI, whether that's investment, talent, hardware, or data. Having said that, I think it's important to understand that research and development of AI in Russia is being led by the defense community, which is why it's important to our type of audience. And the emphasis there is on military robotics, unmanned vehicles and systems, electronic warfare, cyber and information warfare. So Russia is not going to lead the world on AI, but it has a pragmatic approach to AI development and deployment. And I believe that it would be very well positioned and capable to use that undermines U.S. interests.
And it seems as though, Rita, you may have frozen. So while your connection comes back, maybe Elsa, could you jump in and talk a little bit about the China side?
Sure. So it's not news at this point that China has aspired to lead the world in AI. That's been clear since the New Generation AI Development Plan came out in 2017. Certainly, China's progress has been significant, yet, of course, there are a number of weaknesses and challenges that persist in China's innovation ecosystem, from chips to some of the shortfalls in talent that have persisted. But when it comes to the Chinese military, since some of the reforms around that have been launched from 2015 and 2016, and especially since Xi Jinping announced the pursuit of intelligentization as a core element of the PLA's modernization in 2017, this notion of developing AI for a range of applications and incorporating it into the system of systems that enables Chinese military capabilities has been a significant direction of the PLA's development across any number of applications, from suicide drones and weapon systems with varying degrees of autonomy to applications in electronic warfare, cyber operations, interest in wargaming, and of course, beyond that, some of the practical applications in intelligence, big data analytics that have relevance both not only to surveillance, but also to how the PLA thinks about establishing situational awareness for the future battlefield. And certainly the ambition is there. The progress, I think, has been more rapid than expected on some fronts. But of course, the PLA, as a force that is still very much in the midst of reforms, is undertaking changes to its organization. Is still grappling with some of the concepts, with experimentation, and I think it's still a ways away from being able to undertake truly intelligentized operations. Yet, as a revolution in military affairs progresses, the PLA, I think, has come to believe that these are core to a future decision advantage, information superiority, and I think we'll continue to see significant investments and advancements on these fronts in the years to come. And I'll stop there for now, but happy to go into details as the conversation progresses.
Great, thanks. Well, I think Rita is now poaching Wi-Fi from her neighbor, so she might have a better signal now. Rita, could you pick up where you dropped off and finish your thought?
Oh my gosh, I apologize for that. And now I am convinced it's Russian interference. So let me just skip a few of the beginning points and give you the crux of the conversation. Essentially, Russia has a pragmatic approach to AI development and deployment, and it will be able to use AI-enabled technologies to advance its foreign policy goals in a way that undermines U.S. interests. So what I wanted to focus the conversation right now is the military investments that are made by Russia. So over the past 5 years or so, the Russian Ministry of Defense has set up an entire network of research and development organizations and centers that are focused on emerging technologies that collaborate with different industry partners as well as academic researchers. The government, and especially the Ministry of Defense, are seeing great potential in military applications of AI. And they have a vision that they're hoping to use AI in a way that enhances existing Russian strengths and capabilities, but also makes up for what is known as their weaknesses and asymmetries. Whether it's a question of manpower, economic stagnation, or the fact that they're falling behind in technological advances. So we're seeing three major areas of investment. One being military robotics and unmanned systems, and those are with a range of autonomous capabilities, and they're being used for things like demining, ISR, resupply, evacuation, combat support functions, as well as low-cost drones that can be deployed as autonomous wingmen for human pilot. The second area looks into electronic warfare technology, where Russia in general has made significant progress over the past decade. And there's an interest in using automation and AI to enhance electronic warfare capabilities for reconnaissance, for jamming enemy communications, and also to support air and missile defense. And some of those systems have already been deployed and field tested in Ukraine and Syria. And finally, there's, of course, the information warfare component, including cyber warfare. We know by now that information warfare is such a fundamental part of Russian national security thinking about the future of war. So it shouldn't really be surprising to us that they're hoping to leverage AI in order to increase the speed, the reach, and the impact of influence operations, of cyber attacks, and other forms of information warfare. Finally, in addition to these three areas of investment, I think another important point to note, especially when we're thinking comparatively to the American approach on AI, is the fact that the Russian military is generally known to move faster when it comes to testing and experimentation under near operational or even essentially operational conditions. And even when these technologies fail, kind of like mine did today, and kind of like theirs do quite often, they are taking this as an opportunity to learn not only about what the technology can do, but also how the technology is integrated with their existing concepts of the operations, plans and techniques, and all of their techniques. So to summarize, the Russian development and deployment of AI is being government-led, and particularly defense-led. And there's a major focus on military robotics, electronic warfare, cyber and information warfare. They're quick to test, and they learn the limitation under operational conditions. So while Russia is behind China and behind the United States, I believe that it will be able to use AI to advance its goals in foreign policy. Thank you. And once again, sorry.
No worries. So we've got a couple questions from the audience. I think we started this off talking specifically about Russia and China. And I think between sort of the themes of great power competition, and of course, they're the largest economies that have perhaps the most illiberal views of deploying emerging technology. Are there other countries other than Russia and China out there that we should be paying attention to that are making investments in AI? For any of the panelists?
I can go. Are you thinking in terms of, you're referring in terms of what our allies are doing or some other adversaries?
Well, certainly the EU and other allies in general, I think, are interesting. I would imagine that their values are aligned with ours in terms of how they're investing in and employing the technology. But certainly, as we talk about the bad guys out there, places like Iran and North Korea and others, are there significant AI investments that are happening in other parts of the world other than Russia and China that we should be paying attention to?
Hi, Charles. I'll just jump on briefly and just say from the National Security Commission's perspective, we're definitely interested in the rivals you just mentioned. So we've looked at Russia and China and their strategies, but we think it's also important not to ignore Iran, North Korea, and importantly, non-state actors, which we think can improve their super empowerment in the age of AI. We think there's a lot of weapons that could be generated in the AI era at a relatively low cost area, and we shouldn't ignore non-states, such as AI engineered pathogens, being used in the United States by non-state actors. So that's a range of threats that our commissioners are looking at from our perspective.
Great, thank you. So I guess then, as we talked a little bit about the adversary space, I think at least we like to think that there's sort of a bright line in terms of how we think about, invest in, and deploy AI within our own national security apparatus and that of our adversaries. I guess I'm interested in what really is the perspective from the Commission on how the U.S. should be deploying, investing in and deploying and adopting AI, and how does that differ from Russia and China, which we just heard about?
No, that's a very important question. And for all the listeners, we should say that of all our lines of effort to study the competitiveness of the United States on the subjects of AI, ML, and associated technologies, ethics is its own line of effort for us. We have commissioners and staff totally devoted to the subject of fleshing out what does responsible AI look like with American distinctives. And so with that, it basically comes down to how AI can be developed, employed with values and the rules of law that we've come to cherish. Specifically when you dig down into values and the rule of law, there's three general categories that the Commission studies and has made recommendations on already that come down to civil liberties, protecting human rights, and protecting privacy. To just give you a sample of the depth of which that we're committed to making recommendations and strategy along those lines and how it might differ from our rivals, some specific examples of recommendations that we've already made in some of our quarterly reports include how you would use tools and technology itself to actually police other forms of technology, to probe for bias, to probe for inference, and how apps actually collect data. This could even come down to ad tech and how ad tech functions on some of our social media platforms. There's also a sense that we can make sure that when AI is employed, that the access and the usability for AI reaches the broadest collective background of Americans, and so that everybody has access to what we see as a digital revolution that's coming, and that nobody's left behind. For a third example, when we're conducting research and development in the AI era, we've done a gap analysis of the different ethical standards that are being used by national security agencies across the entire enterprise to say how are they baking ethical considerations into the way they do R&D from the beginning. I'm talking 6-1 basic research. And so that in some sense, our values are infused from birth. We can say from what we see in the intelligence record, it's hard to find analogs of this kind of intensity in Russia and China. It's not to say that they don't exist. It's harder to find such a concerted effort to pursue things this way. And of course, there's a wide literary, almost an assumption now in the literature that China and Russia are less inhibited about how they not only pursue AI, but even how they pursue general artificial intelligence as separate and distinct from how the US would do so. And so that is just to draw a line about it. I would finally conclude that our commissioners are really passionate about how these values distinction would pull together a coalition of nations that are focused on common values, and that ultimately, when we compete with Russia and China, we can never compete with Russia and China alone. But that to the degree that our values and our rules of law align with allies and partners, there's a power there that's strategic, and that our commissioners are very devoted to thinking about specific moves that the U.S. should make to harvest that.
Great, thanks. Any thoughts on the topic from other panelists?
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify a little bit of what PJ was saying, is that I think it's a fairly safe assumption that, let me say this first, is that artificial intelligence is revolutionary for military affairs, but I wouldn't expect it to change military affairs in such a way that the fundamental way of war fighting that our adversaries undergo will change that much. So it's a pretty safe assumption that if we see an adversary such as the Russians that are employing military force that targets civilian populations, bombing hospitals, that sort of thing, we can expect the same kind of employment of force to be used into future warfighting environments. I think we could also, it's also safe to assume that if they choose to automate those platforms, they will not put in the kind of gates that we would expect to say, oh, that's a hospital, you know, we're going to get that through optical recognition, through OCR. Oh, don't target it. That's not how they think about it. They think about it in terms of maximum flexibility. How can I employ as much force on targets to the highest degree possible? So that is not the American way of warfighting. We care about that. So what I would expect, and you know why I'm so passionate about the topic, is that we want to inculcate into our processes the ethical way and moral way of warfighting, and we want to do that with our partners. We don't go to war alone. We can't do this by ourselves. We have to do this with partners. And so my question was kind of along the same lines as Rita's, is that when you start looking outside the United States, and where investment in this space is quite robust in Europe and other places around the world in Southeast Asia, those are great partnerships to start talking about, because we can do a lot more together than we can just by ourselves.
And I would add as well, when it comes to ethics, there are relatively robust conversations underway in China, though there can be quite a discrepancy between principles and practice. So for instance, if you look at the Beijing AI principles, which came out last spring, the notion of AI to do good. AI should be designed and developed to promote the progress of human society and human civilization, to promote sustainable development. These are arguably sort of generalizable principles that any number of actors might agree with. But then when you contrast that to the ways in which China's party state is using AI in practice, including to enable and scale up censorship and surveillance, infamously in Xinjiang, where the exploitation of surveillance to that end is occurring against the backdrop of what is starting to be described with grave seriousness as a genocide targeting China's Uyghur minority, including, and I think this is a case where the contrast is especially clear, whereas the U.S. has looked to mitigate bias in AI systems, including inadvertent instances where, for instance, facial recognition may work differentially on folks of different skin tones, for instance. Chinese algorithms for facial recognition and surveillance are designed with prejudice as not a bug but a feature, for instance, to identify the faces of Uyghurs and track them on the basis of their ethnicity alone, under the aegis of counterterrorism. So I think there is a clear discrepancy, and I think a lot is at stake when it comes to how to think about the normative dimensions of the continued progression of AI. But at the same time, as we've seen with the Beijing AI principles and China's espoused commitment in its AI plan to become a leader in the global governance of AI, there are ways in which China may try to contest a position of leadership when it comes to the international conversations underway on the future of AI. And while China has not been very active, for instance, in conversations on autonomous weapons so far in the UN, beyond rather ambiguously espousing commitment to a ban, yet defining what is to be banned in such a way as to have no constraints upon their own developments, we could see kind of greater contestation when it comes to norms and values going forward. And I think that makes it all the more critical in the United States and with our allies and partners and like-minded countries to make sure that we're setting a high standard and that we are truly living up to our own values. And I think that requires taking a hard look at in ways in which AI has been used in ways that raise concerns of bias in policing and homeland security in the United States, and to make sure that we are not just staking out a high ground, but making sure that we are there and we are critical of our own of when we fail to live up to the principles that we're trying to bring into the development of AI today.
Just really quickly, I completely agree with the points that are being raised by my colleagues here. But I think it's also really important to note that while there might be divergence and disagreements on ethics and preferences for sure, there is also has to be some room for perhaps not cooperation, but at least conversation and the ability to implement protocols in cases of emergencies that as advances as the AI is being integrated into military systems. That just because we diverge on ethics does not mean that our adversaries are not practical and are not looking to avoid dangerous technologies that would endanger, first of all, their own military personnel before they even could harm their enemies. So I think it's important to be cognizant of, the discrepancies in ethics, and of course those are fundamentally important, but also be aware that there is room for conversations and collaboration on AI safety.
Absolutely, and I'd add it's heartening to see that some of these conversations are underway and have been reasonably productive when it comes to thinking about pragmatic parameters for risk reduction, how to anticipate ways in which AI systems or autonomy could factor into a crisis scenario. Certainly, if you think about the East China Sea or the South China Sea and the fact that the PLA is operating drones or unmanned systems, some of which are starting to have varying degrees of autonomy in just about every domain, there is the risk of certainly a crisis that could have unintended escalation. And I think trying to understand differences in doctrine, in tolerance for risk, in level of confidence, and how that informs decision making on safety and testing. I hope that I also hope that there's room for productive engagement on that front. And I would also say that personally, when I talk about the U.S.-China relationship today, try to focus on the fact that this is intensely competitive, but perhaps not inevitably adversarial. I think I worry we fall into sometimes an enemy image and tendency to exaggerate or see with some amount of mirroring or distortion the state of play in China today. So I think it's certainly a complex competition that is intensifying, but there's also the reality is, especially if you look at the state of play in AI today, there's also extensive collaboration between American and Chinese companies and researchers, not only in AI, but also, for instance, in biomedical research relevant to the COVID response. So it's not so simple just to say these are our adversaries, especially when there is this current degree of interdependence between the US and Chinese economies and innovation ecosystems. And the reality of where we are today makes these conversations all the more complex. And how we think about the competition depends on which level of analysis we're looking at. And there is, I think, a lot of benefit that has come with engagement and collaboration technically, and hopefully that can be sustained, especially in critical domains like AI safety and security.
Just to briefly agree and build on what Rita and Elsa have said, at the Commission, when we engage other nations and we have discussions with them in what we call our line of effort 5 on allies and partners, we find broad agreement and consensus that it's important to talk about things like strategic stability and how AI would be used in systems of the entire engagement chain, from nuclear command and control systems down to weaponeering, targeting, and details like that really have to be talked about. Elsa referred to how AI could be used anytime it's in an industrial control system. You have to think about accidents. We've been aggressively talking about normal accidents, how AI accidents could occur. We got a chance to speak to Charles Perrow before he passed away this year, the father of normal accident theory, and some of his protégés that still speak about that. And I think when you talk about the importance of strategic stability, there's broad agreement that we should discuss with our rivals and actually make recommendations about what that would look like.
Great, thank you. Really sort of fascinating to see the difference. So kind of with that in mind, I'd be interested in talking a bit more about how the U.S., and particularly the intelligence community, is adopting artificial intelligence. Certainly we have concerns about how some of our adversaries are employing it. Be interested to kind of walk through some specific examples of where we're using it, and we feel as though the way that we're employing it and taking advantage of it is consistent with our democratic values, and is also perhaps transformative to the missions that it's enabling. So maybe Brian, could you kick us off with some examples perhaps from DIA?
Yeah, absolutely. So at DIA, we have 69 separate artificial intelligence programs that are running at various levels of maturity. Some are fully deployed, some are still very embryonic. We had a very significant milestone just passed in June for our MARS program, which is our Machine Assistant Analytic Repository System. So this is our big play into improving the order of battle mission at DIA. So the order of battle, for those who don't know, is how we count the size and scope of a given military and its capabilities. So it's our ability to discern, here is a country, here's how many tanks it has, how many soldiers, how many planes, and so forth. And upon that information, it's our foundational intelligence upon which we build to write products that say the likelihood of war outbreaking in this area is XYZ. The MARS program recently deployed their infrastructure module on that, which really focuses on roads, infrastructure like bridges, some structures, information technology. All of those pieces help inform how we would characterize the capabilities of that given country. It's just our first minimally viable product. There's still many that come forward, but that work is tremendously important for a couple of reasons. Aside from doing the foundational work, it also is helpful for us to start informing platforms that are going to ingest that type of information in order to make battlefield level decisions. So when we start talking about what is the future, airframe that has yet to be drawn up on the boards, how is DIA going to provide information to that platform? And MARS is our first entree into that space to say, this is how we envision how that information is going to go forward. And I think that program also embodies a lot of our, again, ethics, our ethical principles. The reason why mapping out an order of battle is so important to us is because we have things like no strike lists. These are things like refugee camps, hospitals, schools. These are things that we say, these are, according to our rules of war, we will not do those things. And we make that very, very clear, and our allies share those values. So we want to be sure that when we say, we know this is a military training camp, we have a high degree of assurance for that. So we're putting a lot of care into that. We, in fact, call it a duty of care mission. And under a duty of care mission template, we say, this is how we protect that. So now that's a little more straightforward because that is a foreign-facing mission. So we know that U.S. persons data is very unlikely to be kind of caught up in that process. But when we have other missions that are given to our agency that have U.S. citizens involved, we have to look at it in a different way. So we have a program called Sable Spear, which was a counter-narcotics program focused on trying to identify fentanyl, synthetic opioids that are coming from China into the United States. So, of course, there are U.S. citizens that are involved in this criminal enterprise, and they're bringing that stuff in illegally. Our focus, of course, is foreign. So we are only looking at the countries outside the United States to understand those sorts of things. And what we ended up doing in that particular program was overlaying a new schema so that we were ensuring that any U.S. person's data that came into that environment was obscured to those who didn't have a need to know to access it. There are other similar programs in the IC, and we just kind of map that program over for the same civil liberties types of protections that we want to have. So if you're working an investigation and you know that someone's involved in that criminal enterprise and you work for the FBI, for example, you can ask for permission to see that information because you have an active case with a warrant and everything else that comes along with that. So when you start looking at a problem that is as big as the opioid crisis, which kills about 30,000 Americans a year, you're talking about millions and millions and millions of doses coming into the United States all the time, and so many targets that are coming into the United States, there's no way a human could do it. So having the kind of structure around protecting that data before we start collecting it and start processing it, vitally important. So that's how we're kind of approaching it, at least in those two examples.
Great, thank you. I guess I'd turn to some of the other panelists to highlight maybe perhaps other activities that they're involved in that are kind of in other parts of the federal government. Certainly there's the Joint AI Center that the Pentagon launched a couple of years ago as another example of a large-scale investment in AI. I guess, how are those going to the extent that you're involved or familiar? Are we investing in the right things, and are we seeing what hopefully will be some transformative results for U.S. national security as a result. So maybe I'll start. Elsa, any thoughts on that?
I focus more on what's happening in China, so I'll defer to the expertise of others on how to think about what the state of play is in the U.S. But one interesting comparison I'd point to is that initially I would have said that there was much more happening with the use of AI and wargaming in China than in the United States. There have been a number of competitions convened, the development of AI wargaming systems that the PLA has been experimenting with names like War Skull or Prophet that have provided one means of starting to do what the PLA is, what I would describe as learning without fighting, how the PLA is trying to learn and experiment to understand the future operational environment while being a military that's trying to innovate in peacetime. And a renaissance in Chinese military wargaming has been a major element of that. And inspired by AlphaGo, the PLA has been doing starting to experiment with some of these new techniques to enhance wargaming, have a more intelligent adversary in those scenarios. There's recently been, I know, a number of new initiatives, including with support from DARPA, looking at parallel advances in wargaming in the U.S. context as well. And I think although this is not directly a combat mission, when it comes to trying to scope out and understand what some of the implications of emerging capabilities and their development for the balance of power, trying to develop new concepts of wargaming is an important element of that. And I'll defer to the rest of the panel on more of the specifics for programs and initiatives. But I'd say that it's hard, as somebody who spends much of my time looking at China, it's heartening to see a lot of the great initiatives underway in the U.S. And I think there's definitely been a pretty rapid ramping up of programs in the past couple of years.
I can speak to some of the research that CSET has done. We've have a forthcoming report that looks into U.S. military investments in autonomy and AI, and we look specifically into the S&T budget, so like the basic, applied, and advanced research initiatives by the Army, Navy, Marines, the Air Force, and DARPA. And I think one of the more interesting things that come up is that although, you know, we talk about like the future, there's a bit of a theme that the future of war is not going to have any human beings involved in it anymore. When you're actually looking into the way that the United States military is thinking, or at least where it is investing, there is a huge emphasis on human-machine teaming. And of course, that's a very broad concept that encompasses the numerous different ways that people and technologies can collaborate and work together, and how technology can be used to enhance human intellectual intelligence as well as physical capabilities. But again, the emphasis on human-machine teaming is really pronounced in a lot of the U.S. military research that's related to autonomy and AI. Right? So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about these futuristic technologies that are not necessarily, actually not at all being developed to replace human beings, but to augment and collaborate with.
Great. So, and then PJ, I guess from your perspective with the commission, how does the commission view the more broad scale investment in AI as a national capability, and how does that intertwine with the national security interests that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I think for all our participants, what I'd like to do is just take a step back and just talk about the fact that as an independent commission, you know, we've been stood up to look at the competitiveness of the United States on the subject of AI, ML, and associated technologies. The associated technologies was defined in our interim report broadly as those technologies would span what we call the AI stack. This is everything that's required to make an AI application work as we know that they do now. That includes the data, that includes the hardware processing. Processing has three species. There's current CMOS processing, there's advanced materials, and then there's advanced computing like quantum and neuromorphic subjects. All three of those categories are just one element of the whole AI stack, because advanced compute tends to advance the state of the art in AI. Then there's also just the state of the art in AI engineering and actually making the algorithms, which is a different talent. And then the state of the art in making applications and integrating them into operation. All of those things I just mentioned, data, hardware, applications, and the actual algorithms themselves all have different talent pools. So that's what we consider the AI stack. And those are where it takes our research and our analysis for the nation into associated technologies just beyond the AI apps themselves. So I just want to make that clear. In terms of us looking at competitiveness of the United States, the broad strategic conclusion that our commissioner has been saying just recently, yesterday, testified before the HASC, is that we're in a competition with great power rivals for the fundamental infrastructure upon which nations will be built. Some people have called this the battle of platforms. You can see this playing out in sectors, but we shouldn't tunnel vision on them, like the 5G competition. It's a very important competition, but it's just the beginning of a much larger grand strategic picture of competing for the fundamental infrastructure upon which nations will increasingly be built. You can think about, like, after World War II, when Eisenhower went into a grand infrastructure program in the United States that ensured that even our highways could land strategic bombers. We think the next generation of infrastructure for the United States is digital. Digital infrastructure is the fundamental infrastructure upon which nations are increasingly built. And so that is sort of the grand strategic part of the diagnosis that's in our interim report. And so that takes us down into an approach that we've woven out. I can explain a little more about our diagnosis and our basic arguments, but for those, just to get a sense of where we see strategically from the United States, I first want to mention that the United States is well underway with strategy associated with AI. We are by no means, as a commission, starting from zero. The nation as a whole has been running, and as a commission, we've just been stepped in to ask to help to look at our competitiveness, where are those gaps, and how do we close them. To that end, we have 7 basic lines of research that kind of show you what our strategic approach is. Really quickly, those lines of effort are where we place our bets, Charles. So it's kind of what you were talking about. We call it the research and development line of effort, LOE1. And of course, this really looks into where is tech going. You have to care about where your rivals are going. The third level of analysis is where those two combine, where tech is going, where our rivals are going. And the fourth thing is what we should do about it. It also, has to do with some of our commissioners are very well steeped in the state of the art themselves. We have commissioners that were former presidents of computer science at Carnegie Mellon. And so they have a sense of where the nation should place our bets, and that we call LOE1. LOE2 is simply our application or our organization LOE, which is basically looking at how does the entire national security enterprise unite around best practices that can align strategy to AI application. We're basically removing barriers to success. To your previous question, it's kind of how we view the JAIC in the DoD, efforts like AIM in the IC, which is continuing to evolve and change. And to a lesser extent, one that's not talked about enough, but it's really fascinating, and the State Department runs in their Global Engagement Center something called the Technology Engagement Team, which has created an entire life cycle for fielding technological solutions to defeating state-led disinformation. It's a fascinating program. They're already up and running. They're like fully underway for that. So I think in the organization sense, there are organizations that are moving, and we're simply analyzing how to improve that. Third, we recognize that there's a battle for talent. There is a global battle for talent, and we cannot come in second in that battle. And so that's our LOE3 for talent. LOE4 is projecting our systemic strengths as a nation. And so we think we have systemic strengths at microelectronics and semiconductors is a place that we've talked about in our interim reports already. And how would we protect and project those strengths as a whole and with our allies and partners as a consideration? I've already mentioned our LOE5, which is our allies and partners LOE. We know that there's strategic strength in doing this with unified nations or like-minded values, believe in the rule of law. And then finally, we have our ethics LOE, which I previewed for you before. And then our threat analysis LOE, which I'm in charge of, which is basically looking at how our rivals are doing things with AI and to AI and what we need to do about it. So those 7 LOEs kind of show you, in essence, our lines of research that we think, if we were to place our bets correctly, get better organized, win the talent war, protect our strengths, do this as a coalition, do it with American distinctives, and blunt what we must in our red rivals, we think we would fundamentally alter the competitiveness of the United States. And that's the basic argument.
Great, thank you. We've been collecting questions from the audience. I think we've answered several of them along the way, but there's a few that hit on areas that we haven't really talked about so far. I guess the first one I'd like to highlight really is our domestic workforce. We've seen over the last, say, 15 years, a tremendous focus on trying to build the cybersecurity workforce in the country. And I think we're now entering an era where perhaps our artificial intelligence workforce is the next big area where we need sort of systemic investment in order to ensure that we have the talent pools needed to execute on these visions. I guess I'm curious from the panelist perspective, are we doing enough? Should we be doing more? And how does that compare to perhaps what our adversaries are doing?
So I think the quick answer is no, we're not doing enough. And I think there's some cultural change issues that we have to embrace and think about differently. So one of the trends and this is anecdotal, but one of the things that I really bristle at is I hear people think about AI as a cyber problem. So when they see that we've got a bunch of people in the cyber workforce, they say, "Oh, you're a cyber gal or guy. Let's pull you in and you can do this AI project." No, they are not synonymous. They are not synonymous at all. One, the AI discipline is highly cognitive, very much end-to-end design thinking. A cyber analyst, like an intrusion set analyst, that's very tactical, trying to figure out what exactly is going on in this particular intrusion or what's going on in this particular network, right? Entirely different skill sets, entirely different trainings in the academy, entirely different mission problems. I can say for our agency, we are taking this quite seriously. So we actually have two prongs to what we are looking at in terms of the future for our workforce. One is a reskilling program, which will have three components to it, which I'll get to in a second. And then we're looking at hiring folks at more junior levels. So we are in the process of working on a program where we're starting to look at high school opportunities. So students that we can bring in early and train them up and hopefully join the agency, clear them as they go through, and then help them go through their college training and hopefully train them in a data science discipline. And as we do that, we are trying to bring them along and understand the practical application of what we're trying to do in the mission space and bring them along. It also helps us with competing in the talent market when salaries are astronomically high in this space. So our hope is that we're going to be able to offer something to these students that can't be found anywhere in industry. Like if you want some real tough, hairy problems, we got them. We got them in spades. So we want you to come work for us. That being said, is that the one thing we can offer you that you're not going to get working at a Google or an Amazon or Walmart is, and at Walmart, I mean the data science side, not as a greeter. If you are looking at a tough challenge and you wake up in the morning, you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, I did that. I did that. I secured the nation today. Right? It's a very different, very rewarding feeling, and it means more than actually paying $200,000 to $300,000 a year. The reskilling program that we're looking at is actually a three-tiered process where we're looking at an executive level, a practitioner level, and then a more advanced level. So practitioner level is fairly understandable. It's folks that are trying to learn, this is a project that we ran, what are some best practices, here are some tricks in Python, those are the types of things we'll teach. At the executive level, it's to make you conversant in the skills. Our understanding, one of the challenges in the workforce is that we've got folks that are at that practitioner level, they're doing good things, and when they talk to their bosses kind of go, sounds great. Keep doing it. Right? Seems like customers love it. Outstanding. Keep doing it. Well, that's not because they're not interested in what they're doing. It's just that they can't even speak the same language. So we have to kind of bring them along in an executive level training program so that they can be conversant with their subordinates in that space. And then that last tier, the more advanced tier, is really training a very small number of our workforce for like master's degrees and PhDs in data science programs, so that when that practitioner level runs into a real tough spot, they can go to those folks and ask them questions about, I can't get around to this particular issue. So for us, it's a multi-pronged way of going at the problem. There will be folks that are going to leave. They're going to go take other jobs in industry. But we want to make it easier for them to come back too. And so we're also looking at programs like industry exchange programs where they can go off and see what some of the best practices are at some of the higher tech firms and get an understanding of what's going on and bring that back to us. Likewise, we're also offering that to industry to come see us. So they get to work with us in the space. We clear them up. They get to work on our problems with us. So yeah, we're not going to pay them $300,000 a year, but another company might. So right. Those are just a couple of things we're doing.
Sort of a famous quote in this space from an early Facebook employee is the best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads. right? And as we think about AI and national security, right, I would hope that even if we can't pay as much as the big tech companies in national security, we can still provide that mission impact and value. So another topic that came up really is around data and access to data and stovepiping of data, and whether, say, Russia and China face the same challenges we do, particularly on the national security side, where we have a lot of really interesting data, but because of either legacy system issues or authorities issues, it's not all in one place, and it can't be because of a variety of restrictions. Does China, let's say, and then Russia have that same challenge? And are there lessons learned, perhaps, or not lessons not to learn from our adversaries and how to get access to the data that we need in order to be successful?
Yes and no, I would say. To some extent, these challenges are endemic to any bureaucracy by definition, and certainly a military organization, especially one of the size and diversity of the PLA in some respects, when you're talking about a force that in some respects is very modern, very informatized in terms of its development of information technology, whereas other elements of it don't quite have the same capability. I think the Chinese military in and of itself is far from monolithic if you're looking across services, across different research communities and organizations. So certainly the tendency towards stovepiping has been a problem in Chinese military modernization and informatization, or the initial IT and C4ISR development. To some degrees, these issues do persist when it comes to intelligentization or the development of AI and related technologies today. But at the same time, while the problems of military big data, as Chinese defense academics have discussed, do include some that will sound familiar to an American audience, not, for instance, not necessarily having understanding of where the data is and how it's available, the best employment of it, ways to integrate it and start to process it. There are dedicated efforts, especially, for instance, within the Academy of Military Science, which has a National Innovation Institute of Defense Technology, including an AI research center that's becoming a hub and center of gravity for Chinese military research in AI. There are efforts to create more of a nexus, and that could facilitate the integration of data as well as a concurrent bringing together of technical specialists and technologists with strategists to try to think more about some of the long-term implications there. So I think the PLA is starting to recognize that data is a critical research to modern military operations. One phrase that I think encapsulates this would be, without data you can't fight, or no data, no war. You can't function as military unless you are able to manage and leverage that data. And certainly the PLA may be behind the U.S. in some respects on this front, as a force that doesn't have the same global reach and experience, let alone operational experience, that the U.S. does. But I think they're dedicated efforts to start to compensate for that and start to, for instance, leverage big data more at scale in military intelligence, whether that's simpler applications leveraging natural language processing, or more complex analytics that could inform targeting, including in information operations. So, and I would also, though this is a topic we could devote a whole other breakout session to in and of itself, that when we think about the notion of data advantage, I tend to reject the notion that data is the new oil and China has a clear and decisive advantage because of that. If we're talking about the Chinese military in particular, certain amounts of the data that Chinese civilian enterprises and the commercial ecosystem are leveraging may be relevant for training algorithms in general, but the PLA will have its own challenges with military big data in particular, and the capacity of the Chinese government to, for instance, make significant amounts of data available to support the development of facial recognition and surveillance capabilities is a unique edge, but that doesn't mean that the U.S. is necessarily disadvantaged, and examples of advances in synthetic data, generative adversarial networks, techniques that can leverage less data, and that may represent the direction machine learning is progressing and going forward, will be important. So I think, there are reasons to recognize that China has certain systemic features of the capacity to share and integrate data pursuant to military-civil fusion as a national strategy that could be advantageous, but it's a complex landscape, and to be more precise, we'd have to break down by specific sector or application or intended employment of different kinds of data.
Great. So one last question before we get to wrapping up. PJ, I'm curious your thoughts on the whole area of adversarial AI and how we should be thinking about defending against AI attacks as we develop our systems.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, as Brian did, that AI is a separate science from cyber because it involves AI engineering. It involves data management. And you could have all the cyber awareness in the world about how to create or defend against malware, and it's not the same as data management or AI engineering. So when you talk about the whole AI stack, it really is a totally different subject. Generally, in the field today, AI is understood as being the emerging new attack surface about what rivals could do to AI applications. Those come in three basic ways in the sense of what could be done to actually AI algorithms at a certain level. Those are sometimes called white box attacks. What could be done to the system upon which they run, that is manipulating inputs and outputs to AI applications. That's called black box attacks. And then there's actually manipulating, again, the entire data lake upon which an AI application feeds. This is sometimes called hidden box attacks. So this entire typology that I've just mentioned to you is an emerging science. It is an AI computer science specifically. And the United States is, raising up slowly talent that understands that distinction. We have corralled and met with all of them actively. It's an impressive and growing cadre of people who understand that AI is the new attack surface. At the same time, we do think that when we engage with, even the Hill, that we have a long way to go as a commission in explaining the distinction that Brian raised, because there is a really common sense that when I think of AI, I think of cyber. And while AI may manipulate cyber, that is networks, machines, the data that flows upon them, it doesn't mean it's tantamount to AI science, which involves a larger stack. So we have our work cut out for us to explain that distinction to make sure the United States is organized for that future where AI is the new attack surface.
Great. So I guess I'd ask each of the panelists in 20 seconds each, really looking forward, what do you see as the biggest opportunity or the greatest challenge as we look at this new AI future? Rita?
Okay, I'll just go with the challenge, and specifically my concern, I think, is premature deployment because of the risks of accidents and misuse and any unintended consequences that come up, but also because if the technology proves unreliable, it can really undermine the trust in human-machine teaming, which is an important aspect.
Great. Elsa?
If you'll excuse my speaking a bit beyond my bailiwick, I'd say that education is perhaps the greatest opportunity and challenge today, and where I have the most concern the U.S. is falling short and failing to adapt to what is needed for the future of our economy and our society, as well as, of course, as national security. And China has launched national initiatives for education and AI, introduced AI as a major. I mean, if we look at the state of the American education system today, especially amidst the pandemic, I think we're really failing so far to prepare students and ensure they'll have the right training and opportunities for the future. And I think there are also great opportunities there, including the use of AI in education, more customizable, adaptable education that can be personalized and delivered online. Hopefully, there are some interesting startups in that space in China. I see fewer efforts, at least so far, in the US, but I think education is really the foundation of our national competitiveness going forward. And that could be what this competition may hinge on in the long term: talent, education, and the capacity for adaptation.
Great. Thanks, PJ.
Yeah, Charles, just in 20 seconds, I would say my perspective personally is how AI can be used for good is so much more a vast frontier than how AI will be used for bad. I think there's a lot of focus in American literature about how AI is used for bad. I think there's equally the whole transformation of everything from healthcare to how there are ways that we could think about ourselves being more secure in the future when we curate AI with American distinctives.
Great. Brian?
Yeah, I will circle back to something that was just touched on very quickly, which was about how we cooperate with our adversaries as well as, in that competition space. And I think if I were to leave the group with something is to say, it's important that we not have an exploitative relationship with those adversaries. I completely subscribe to the idea that we want to have safety involved, but like what I think about is like an analog to the nuclear industry, right? We want nuclear power plants to be safe, but we don't want to provide information that leads someone to proliferate nuclear weapons. We should be thinking about the knowledge space in AI in the same way. We should be enabling safe use of AI, but we also should be thinking about the other piece of it. It's like, how can this particular solution that we're working on with our adversaries be used against us? We need to be thinking about that all the time, and we probably should look at security models that match closely to what we did to control that type of information.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining. I think this was an excellent discussion. Looks like we've got a 15-minute break leading up to our closing plenary panel, which looks to be a great lineup. So enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks so much.
What a great panel. We appreciate all the panelists for some really thought-provoking ideas and comments. So right now, we're going to take a very short break, only 15 minutes, as we get ready for the final panel, which is, and this will start at 1:45 Eastern Time, and this is going to be a panel on diversity in the intelligence community. Does reality meet aspirations? It'll be hosted by Lieutenant General retired Vince Stewart. You don't want to miss it. We'll see you at 1:45.